Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. The topic, as you know, is culture and hybrid workplaces. Today's presenters are Dr. Robert Cooke, our CEO, Michael Kern, one of our senior consultants, and me, Kathleen Cooke. I oversee the client experience here at Human Synergistics. We will be doing a Q&A at the end, so please submit any questions through the questions pane. And also, to anticipate your question, we will be emailing out a link to the PowerPoint and webinar recording later this week. So let's move on to the three topics we'll be discussing today. They're here on your screen. We'll be talking about identifying constructive cultural norms for hybrid organizations. We're talking about norms that promote effectiveness or outcomes that we all care about, like employee engagement and low turnover, teamwork, adaptability, and profitability. We'll be discussing creating a pervasive culture, or one that is consistent and strong across the entire organization, specifically today talking about both for remote and on-site employees. And lastly, we'll be talking about shaping culture through levers for cultural change, like employee engagement, goal setting, and rewards and recognition. So you may have heard us talk in the past about the risks associated with creating cultures for, specifically the trends around creating outcome-specific cultures, creating a culture for diversity, innovation, quality, a culture for learning or knowledge, creating a culture for reliability, or a culture for wellness. The latest one is around creating a culture for remote or hybrid workplaces. There have clearly been numerous challenges and focal points over the years, and the pandemic just poses us with another challenge or problem. So across all of these problems I just mentioned, we really just need to remain focused on creating that constructive culture overall, which will result in positive outcomes. Now, the additional challenge with hybrid workplaces is we need to think about creating a culture that's really consistently constructive across those working on-site and those working remotely. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Cooke, who I know you're all excited to hear from, who will flesh out some of these points for us. You might be on mute.
Thank you, Kathleen. I am going to talk about points you made in just a little bit more detail and differentiate between two issues here around culture. One has to do with causal direction and causality. The other has to do with the consistency among cultures. You know, when we're facing a major change or a major problem, major challenge, like COVID, and what organizations have to do to adapt, we're very tempted to just implement all these solutions, these structures, these systems that are just put into place. They're selected without regard to the kind of culture we want to aim toward or the kind of culture that we might already have. And when that happens, we have these events driving culture and these outcomes that we're looking for driving culture. And the way and the directions in which they drive culture may not be consistent with our values and the culture we would like. So at the top of the slide, the first point is that we really want to address issues around hybrid, on-site, and remote work to strengthen our current culture and let culture and our values drive the responses. And if we're not happy with our current culture, then we can keep in mind the ideal culture, the culture toward which we strive in figuring out ways to deal with hybrid, ways to make it work better. So the second part of this is rather than building a separate culture from the overall organizational culture to deal with remote work, once again, we want to be very sensitive to what our values are and where we want to go. And really, it's best to focus on the overall culture, once again, the values that we have, and what we can do with the overall culture to better address the demands of hybrid workplaces. With that, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the cultural styles that we may want to promote. I know many of you are very familiar with our circumplex and with our organizational culture inventory, but we also notice that there are some people who are sort of new to human synergistics and our frameworks. So please excuse us if we have a couple slides here that may be a little bit redundant for some of you. This is our circumplex, and we have a circumplex of 12 styles that may be encouraged and reinforced by organizational cultures. We also use these 12 styles to measure individual behaviors and group styles as well, but our focus today is on culture. The circumplex is driven by two underlying dimensions. One is suggested by Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, and it's the distinction between behaviors that are associated with achieving satisfaction styles and those that are driven more by security styles, more by insecurity, in fact, and fears. So on the top of our circumplex, we have positive satisfaction-driven styles. At the bottom, we have security-oriented styles. The other distinction is one that's very prevalent in the old leadership literature and the group dynamics literature, and that's the distinction between the people orientation on the one hand and the task orientation on the other hand. Those two distinctions drive our circumplex and our model of culture. And you'll see as we drop the flower down, we have 4 cultural styles that are strongly satisfaction oriented, help people think and behave in ways that will help them meet their higher order needs, and at the same time are very, very functional for groups and organizations. The styles here include 11, which is achievement, think ahead and plan, set challenging yet realistic goals, self-actualizing, maintain your personal integrity, be concerned with your own growth and development, humanistic encouraging, provide others with positive feedback, be supportive, mentor others, and affiliative, cooperate, be open, friendly, be a good team player. These are what we call the constructive styles. And as we go through our slides today, you'll learn once again that we believe that these styles are the best cultural styles for creating a positive hybrid workplace, as well as doing many other things and achieving effectiveness along multiple dimensions. In contrast to the constructive styles, we have what we call the passive defensive styles. These are styles, again, driven by security-oriented needs, very people-oriented styles. They include approval, trying to please others, being concerned about being accepted by others, conventional, following rules, even when they don't seem to apply, not making waves, dependent, always looking to your superiors for answers, following orders, even if they don't seem appropriate. And finally, style 6, avoidance, playing it safe, shifting responsibilities to others, making sure that you're not blamed for any problems. Again, these are relatively fear-driven styles. They are not particularly effective in getting anything done in running a hybrid workplace, or for that matter, innovating, solving problems, etc. And they have negative implications for organizational members, including dissatisfaction, stress, lack of motivation, etc. The third set of styles are what we call the aggressive defensive styles. These are styles like the passive styles that are driven by security needs, but they are more task-oriented. They're more active, they're more aggressive. Oppositional, pointing out flaws, looking for mistakes, being hard to impress. Style 8, power, maintaining one's personal authority, using the authority of one's position, being tough, bossy. Style 9, competitive, trying to outperform others, turning the job into a contest. And finally, style 10, perfectionistic, being precise even when it's not necessary and trying to do everything perfectly. The aggressive defensive styles look good, but actually are not nearly as effective as the constructive styles that really involve doing good. Constructive styles are more productive than the aggressive styles, and we do not see the aggressive styles as being particularly functional in making a hybrid workplace work. Go to the next slide. Michael, can you take over?
Yep, thanks, Rob. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how we quantify and illustrate culture on the Circumplex. At Human Synergistics, we have two versions of our culture survey. One measures what people believe is the ideal culture, and the other measures how they experience the current culture. And that results in two circumplexes, an ideal profile and a current profile. The amount of ink or extension in each style illustrates the strength of the norm. The dark black circle in the middle indicates the 50th percentile or the average. On the ideal version, we ask respondents to think about what should be expected to maximize effectiveness. What we found is that no matter what problems organizations are facing, whatever their current environment, including how to be successful in the hybrid workplace today, people will describe a highly constructive organization. That is one that has extremely high extensions of the blue constructive styles like you see here. On the other hand, on the current version, we ask respondents to think about what's expected to fit in and meet expectations. We get all sorts of profiles, but people want to know what's typical or what's average. And when we look at the average across all organizations, it's of course a round circle at the 50th percentile because that's average. Each organization though has its own unique culture profile. And the revelation really is that when an organization does develop a culture that matches their ideal, when they have strong levels of achievement, growth, self-actualization, when people are encouraging, supportive of others in an open, friendly workplace, that is an organization that succeeds. And it's durable success, meaning even if the environment changes dramatically, just as we experienced 2 years ago with COVID, the organization is best prepared to adapt and innovate and thrive. Now, I'd like to take us back to the focus today on a specific problem organizations are facing, how to build a culture for success in the hybrid work environment. And just like any problem we face, whether we're in a situation where we feel we need to build a culture for innovation or safety or customer service or diversity, we need to first look at our problem-solving effectiveness. And here again, we find organizations oriented around the constructive styles are the most effective problem solvers. When they're passive defensive, they have poor solutions. They are susceptible to and not able to have those solutions widely accepted. We can imagine a hybrid workplace where rules are created, where they're just to be followed regardless of the circumstances in an uncertain workplace environment. In an aggressive organization, some solutions may work well, some may be poor. Thinking of maybe an organization where people are directed by leaders to be in the office at certain times, regardless of the actual business needs. So the acceptance of solutions in that environment is mixed. On the other hand, if an organization approaches a problem of how to be effective in the workplace, in a hybrid workplace, and we do it from a constructive orientation, that organization will come up with high quality solutions and they will be widely accepted. We've seen this today in how organizations approach managing through the problem of the pandemic. We've actually seen this, the same types of results, real time, over the past few decades when we put teams through our survival simulations. And we put thousands of teams through the simulation of surviving a plane crash. And when we've analyzed how the teams solved the problem of survival, passive teams have low quality solutions and they often perish. Aggressive teams may be dominated by a leader who's aggressive, and then we see mixed results. If the aggressive leader solution is high quality, the group survives. If not, they perish. On the other hand, we can see that teams that are highly constructive aren't dominated by an aggressive leader, and the whole team is energized and engaged, freely sharing their ideas. The results are high quality solutions that the team accepts. Okay. So now, how does this all play out in the long term? It looks like the hybrid workplace is here to stay, and while we don't know how effective our solutions for the hybrid workplace will be in maintaining success for the long term, we've seen how things play out in other situations. And that experience can provide insight into how certain organizations solving the problem of how to adapt to the hybrid workplace will perform in the future. When we look at long-term effectiveness, when solutions come from a passive defensive organization, the organization is less likely to adapt successfully, leaving it highly vulnerable. If the organization is oriented toward aggressive defensive styles, they may experience some success, but they may experience distress as well. These organizations are more likely to experience the volatility of highs and lows, successful for a period of time, followed by a period of hardship. However, if they're heavily constructive, they're much more likely to flourish. They're adapting well to the new hybrid workplace, and they're more likely to sustain that success when they face a new challenge. So they're in the higher level realm of sustainability. So now let's take a look at some of the issues that are, I think, especially important during the pandemic and particularly relevant in the past year. We've seen what's been described as the Great Resignation in just the past few months, and every organization is concerned about retention and turnover. When we look at some of the measures of what many people call engagement, we've seen very specifically the impact of constructive versus passive and aggressive cultures. So this is from research pre-pandemic, but the results, I think, have increased importance today. As I said, the Great Resignation has forced organizations to focus on things like intention to stay, satisfaction, turnover. Even beyond that, teamwork has been a challenge in the new workplace. Also, adaptability is more important than ever. And what we found from a study of hundreds of units in a variety of organizations and industries is that there's a positive correlation between constructive cultures and measures of engagement. And there's a negative correlation between both passive defensive and aggressive defensive cultures and these same measures of engagement. So these engagement measures are the outcomes from how we orient our culture. Now, Kathleen is going to tell us a little bit more about that connection.
Thanks so much, Michael. So these are just a few white papers and case studies that really bring to life some of the research and correlations that Michael was just sharing. And it helps to further explain why creating constructive cultures in hybrid workplaces is important for engagement and performance. First one is on culture and profitability. We partnered with Towers on a culture and profitability study, looked at nearly 70 organizations, and we were able to correlate their financial performance with culture by quantifying culture with the OCI. And the study shows a positive relationship between constructive culture and profitability. Incidentally, also a positive relationship between aggressive cultures and financial volatility, so up and down over the years. The research we did with Northwestern University Leadership Institute has similar findings, but the one I want to dig into just briefly is the best of the best in Canada, where we looked at award-winning organizations like Canada's 50 best managed companies, the top 100 companies to work for, and they all had predominantly constructive cultures when we measured with the OCI. They also really understood the importance of the connection between leadership, the leader's impact, culture, and performance. So specifically, I want to just talk about what we found across these organizations. They all had expectations for constructive behaviors that we can aim for in hybrid workplaces. Specifically, pursue challenging goals, maintain our personal integrity, support and develop one another, and communicate and cooperate. You can find all of these case studies and white papers on our website. Down below, you'll see we have ones for Lion, Kern, Sask Central, IBM, and Ohio State University that further exemplify some of this research around constructive styles and profitability and engagement. Next slide, please. So some of you are familiar with our How Culture Works model. This is kind of an extension of what we just looked at. The ideal culture profile for a hybrid workplace is on the left. It aligns with most organizations' written values. We value constructive styles like psychological safety, development, building relationships, working towards those team goals. However, sometimes systems, which you'll see in these blue boxes, don't really reflect these values. So for example, a goal setting system, which we may put in place either pre-pandemic or during the pandemic, may be set up in a way that reinforces internal competition and has people competing with one another, which we know can lead to stress and turnover. Perhaps leaders and managers are pointing out flaws much more frequently than they're informally recognizing good performance, which we all know we have to be so cognizant of and remember to do. Or maybe we're hearing employees but not listening or acting on what they're requesting or giving us feedback on. So if these climate variables that we see in these blue boxes are not aligned with our values and the constructive culture profile that we have in the ideal, we get a defensive culture profile like the one you see here on the right, which in turn affects the outcomes that Michael was mentioning around retention and engagement, which is so important, especially right now. So how can we use some of these levers for change to shape our hybrid workplaces? Let's think about employee involvement and upward communication. Are we listening to and acting on requests and ideas from both remote and on-site employees? And are we getting them involved with crafting solutions for making things equitable for remote and on-site employees? Are we informally recognizing and rewarding both remote and on-site employees for good work in the moment? And are managers still meeting or starting to meet with direct reports to think ahead and plan and work towards those team goals and provide opportunities for development? One of the things we did here at HS around inter-unit coordination, which is a lever for cultural change or a climate variable, is early on in the pandemic, we realized that we had some, like most organizations, time-sensitive, high-priority projects. They required a lot of expertise from numerous departments. So we had to figure out, for example, how to deliver all of our culture and leadership impact accreditation workshops remotely, overnight. How to get our paper team building simulations digitalized so that they could be used virtually. So we had always been, pretty pretty good about having cross-functional teams, and we realized that we needed to have pop-up cross-functional teams. We needed to allow employees to point out when there was a need to get a cross-functional team together and meeting. So that's what we have. We have pop-up cross-functional teams. Some members are remote, some are on site. We meet through Microsoft Teams. We have specific goals, timelines, and budgets. And this is just one brief example of how we leveraged inter-unit coordination, which is a lever for cultural change, and we did it in a constructive way within a hybrid workplace. The result was adaptability during the pandemic. I've just rattled off a few levers for cultural change. There are actually 32 of them. I won't get into all of them. We benchmark and report on them by subgroup, so by level, department, remote versus on-site, so that we can identify opportunities for each subgroup in order to create that constructive, consistent culture in hybrid organizations. Next slide, please. So to summarize, as you're moving towards a hybrid workforce, let's ask ourselves these questions. Do the changes you're implementing communicate and reinforce those expectations for the constructive styles? Are the changes equal in terms of those working remotely and on-site? And do the processes you're using to problem solve reinforce constructive norms? Rob is going to share some concluding thoughts on all of this, and then we will answer some questions.
Thank you, Kathleen. The key is to emphasize organizational culture, not necessarily to emphasize a special culture for hybrid or for adaptability, for innovation. As I said earlier, if your culture is working, fantastic. You should use the onset of the need for hybrid workforces as an opportunity to strengthen that culture. If your culture is not where you want it to be, you can use your ideal and the values when thinking about the changes you want to make to support hybrid. It's basically the first point here: develop systems, structures, jobs, and skills that promote constructive norms among both remote and on-site members. Very importantly, increase the pervasiveness and intensity of the culture. I'll get back to that in a minute. And support the hybrid workforce and promote effectiveness. I just want to take a couple minutes here to talk about some research we did many, many years ago that just happens to be very relevant to what we're going through this year and probably next year. The research focused on the strength of organizational cultures. And we looked at the strength of the cultural styles, like the constructive styles in particular. And not surprisingly, what we found was what we found in other research studies, and that is that if there's a strong extension for an organization on the constructive styles, meaning that people believe that they are expected to think and behave in constructive ways to a very great extent, the organizations are effective. Okay, so strength in terms of people believing that the norms are very strong and they are really expected to be humanistic, to be cooperative, to be achievement-oriented, it works. But that's not the only measure of the strength of cultures. There's another measure that has to do with what we call intensity and the pervasiveness of the culture and the extent to which people within an organization see the culture the same way. And interesting, what we found is that the intensity of a culture, the intensity of a constructive culture in and of itself produces further problem-solving effectiveness and further organizational success. So above and beyond just people thinking yes to an extent, to a great extent, we're supposed to be achievement-oriented. If everyone agrees that they're supposed to be achievement-oriented, then things like cooperation, teamwork, and coordination actually increase even further. So this is another way of saying that we've learned over time that the strength of cultures are important, at least along two dimensions. Okay, the extent to which norms are strong and behaviors are expected, and the extent to which there's general agreement among organizational members about those expectations. This is so relevant to today. I don't think I've ever seen a period when the forces that maintain, reinforce, and perpetuate organizational culture have ever been so weak. I mean, we are talking about organizations that are dispersed. We're talking about people who possibly don't see each other, even though they're in the same work group. Physically, they don't interact. Literally for weeks or months, directly, everything is virtual. There is not nearly as much communication, either written or oral, between people, and communication is a great driver of organizational culture and what's expected. And the list just goes on and on. Now, the crazy thing is, for some organizations, this could actually be beneficial. If you have a strongly defensive culture and it's highly aggressive, we actually got a question about this. What happens to the organization? Well, one thing that can happen is the organization responds very poorly to COVID and to the need for hybrid workforces and makes decisions that really don't work. Another possibility, though, is that the culture gets so weak that people are actually relieved that they're not putting up with the same interactions and the same expectations on a day-to-day basis that they've been putting up with for the past few years. So, you know, there are some benefits to certain cultures actually becoming weaker than they were before. But a better approach is to do what's in the middle here. If your culture was defensive, take advantage of the weakened culture to move your organizational culture and your culture for hybrid in a constructive direction. So crazy, but we know that cultures that are weak are easier to change. So every organization, even organizations with negative cultures, can look at the current situation as an opportunity to do something productive about cultures. So finally, down the bottom, treat new problems, priorities as opportunities to mobilize and reinforce the current operating culture. Or if your current culture is not what you want it to be, to make salient, operationalize, and reinforce new behaviors that are consistent with your ideal culture. Again, it's almost like using a problem as an opportunity to change your culture and improve it in a constructive direction. I think we have one more slide. There we go. In conclusion, what type of culture? Well, I don't want to be redundant, but as we've said throughout past half hour, past 35 minutes, you want a culture that supports constructive behaviors. You want a culture that reinforces people for thinking and behaving in achievement-oriented ways, in humanistic ways, in cooperative ways. You also want a pervasive culture. You want it to span across departments. You want it to span across functional areas and hierarchical levels of the organization. Today, you want that culture to span across different locations, geographies, and very, very importantly, you want it to span against on-site and remote employees. You don't want two cultures. We don't want to end up with sort of an in-group that sees the culture one way, possibly somewhat constructive, and an out-group that sees the culture another way and believes that what's expected of them is more defensive and less constructive. Really what we're looking for is, once again, as I was saying before, a strong, intense culture that is consistently constructive and that encourages people to think and behave in constructive ways. Just a few ideas about how do you do this. I think a lot of organizations already know. I'm reading more and more about fairness and what organizations are doing with their human resource systems, with their resource allocation systems, how they are treating people who are working remotely, as well as people who are working on site. Historically, we have found that employees' perceptions of fairness, whether it be with respect to rewards, opportunities for development, promotions, almost anything else, fairness drives a constructive culture. People who are working in a fair environment believe that they should be fair to others and work in positive ways. I love reading about all the organizations that are doing everything possible to be fair to their remote workers. They're trying to remind themselves that these workers deserve training. They deserve to be considered for promotions. They may be out of sight, but we can't forget them when these kinds of things come up. They also have to be considered with respect to resources, particularly IT resources. We can't just expect all of our employees at all different levels and all different pay ranges to have the IT equipment, the electronic equipment, for example, that they need to work remotely. At the same time, I read about other organizations saying we also have to be fair to those people that we really need on site and who are coming in, commuting long distances, not being available to their family when they may be needed at home, etc. And those organizations are looking into other things that are appropriate for that subgroup, including things like flexible work schedules, okay, and being responsive to what we call work-family conflict and enabling them to leave. I've read about organizations that for a while were setting up daycare centers for their on-site workers. It's an attempt to be fair, constructive to all of your workers and to be responsive to their different needs. Other things that we can do are through technology. Many organizations literally have been saved by things like GoToWebinar, by Teams, by Zoom, by other technologies. And I think it's clear that organizations are going to continue implementing new technologies for communication, for decision-making, etc. I think that's great. I really do. At the same time, I think it's very important for organizations to consider very carefully the implications of the technologies they're putting in place and whether or not people get continuing training to use those technologies and to use them productively. There are so many examples of this. One very minor example, and I'll be quick about this. I read a very interesting article in the February 8th edition of the Wall Street Journal about calendar apps that are now being introduced to help teams schedule appointments at convenient times, to help a superior and a subordinate set up a meeting, et cetera, et cetera. And the app apparently is very useful, but at the same time, some people really have problems about it. They think being sent a calendar showing when your boss is available and when he or she is not available is sort of a power-oriented thing, and that it's more difficult for them to use this app than the person sending it. Other people see it as being very power-oriented. Other people see it as being a use of technology when, someone should just call me up and we'll talk about it and we'll set up an appointment. So I think technology can be very, very helpful in maintaining a culture that's constructive. But I also think that we should be very careful in selecting the technologies and making sure that we modify them so that they work for us. Finally, there are some things that organizations, constructive organizations, have been doing for years that help them maintain their constructive cultures. These things are not a surprise. They're relevant to all organizations. These organizations go heavy on training and development. They accentuate the goal setting process and involvement in goal setting and the importance of connecting individuals with their teams by establishing individual goals that link to the organizational goals. All kinds of employee involvement beyond goal setting continues to be a very major force for driving constructive cultures. And as always, the relative use of reward and positive reinforcement over punishment to create not only a constructive culture, but satisfied, motivated personnel. I think that's just about the end of our presentation. I'll turn it back over to Kathleen and Michael and talk about some questions we received from the audience. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rob. We do have quite a few questions, and we even had a couple come in via email early. So we'll kick off with a couple of those. The first one is, and you touched on this a little bit, Rob, and I can speak to this one first, and then you and Michael can fill in. What impact will the hybrid working environment have on particularly defensive cultures? And my thinking on this one is that without understanding their culture or having any sort of framework of their current and ideal cultures, an organization with a defensive culture is likely going to implement a hybrid workplace in a defensive way because they won't even think twice about it. That's their culture. They'll do things in the same way they've always been done. So a defensive culture will likely be reinforced or even magnified. And I thought about a specific example. So in some organizations, as we know, obviously we're talking about a mix of on-site and remote workers. The on-site workers may need to be on-site because of the nature of their jobs, and they may have specific requests or ideas for what would make things fair. And in a passive culture, their requests would likely be ignored or not even shared by the employees in the first place because employees feel like, well, nothing ever gets done or happens when we share. In an aggressive culture, the requests would likely be met with opposition or even better ideas from leaders. This explains that volatility that Michael mentioned. If the leadership's ideas are even better, outcomes like performance and engagement increase. If they're not, performance and engagement suffer. So here, as Rob was saying, we have an opportunity to get employees involved and to focus on that upward communication, to listen to what employees are saying are going to make things fair, to get them involved in implementing some of those things that are going to make things fair and constructive. Rob, anything to add?
That was great. As you were talking, Kathleen, I couldn't help thinking about a very early cultural development program I did with an organization headquartered in Chicago, had facilities, offices, and plants, I think in about 15 different locations across the United States. And this was like 35 years ago when the OCI was relatively new. I was meeting with the managing directors of each of the locations. And we had OCI results on big sheets of paper for each of them. And they were hanging up around the room. And one of the managing directors said, "Hey, Rob, would you mind if I rearranged all these profiles?" And I said, "No, go ahead." And he rearranged them in terms of proximity to the headquarter office. And it was amazing because everyone knew right away what was going on. And what he was showing us was that as the offices were more and more distant from the headquarters, the cultures were less defensive and progressively more constructive. So this turned into a major conversation. And the conversation was, well, you know, we're all the way out in California. The people really don't travel that much. People from the main office don't travel that much to see us. And we basically do more of what we want than the office like in Cleveland. And because of that, we have the room to create a more constructive culture. And this actually became a serious topic for discussion. This topic is relevant right now. And that is that you can literally see weaker cultures in distant places for an organization that have provided local managers with the opportunity to create a subculture. And I sort of mentioned this before toward the beginning, but it's really very important. We can take advantage of the loose links that characterize culture today to introduce cultures really that are more constructive and more productive. And then we can learn from those subunits and talk about what it takes to make that culture omnipotent and relevant to the entire organization. So again, I think I said this before, we can actually look at some of these challenges to culture as one of our best opportunities to do something about it. Took longer than I thought. Back to you, Kathleen. Michael.
We have another one here that came in early on. For office workers, the office used to primarily function as a place to execute tasks, either individually or with others, intuitively 80% of the time. Additional secondary activities took place around relationship building with colleagues. The last 12 months has shown us that task execution does not need to take place in the office. So in the future, what do you see as the primary function of the office, or are offices even needed? Michael, do you want to start off with that one?
Yeah, I think that's always been a question, and really now it's become something that is of course more relevant. Actually, there's a CEO from Chicago, Jason Fried, and I remember about 10 years ago, he had a TED Talk. He's written a couple books on the remote workforce, and he talked about what is the office for, because it's not for, in his research, it's not for getting things done. And that's, I think in the question, that's been established, but it's something that I think we always felt that when you really want to get something done, you don't go into the office. So the office does serve, I think, other purposes though. And actually we had a group of OD practitioners who met together a couple weeks ago. And we talked about, how is the remote workforce affecting these constructive styles, basically. How are we connecting? How are we achieving? How are we mentoring others? And one of the biggest challenges I think people felt was not on the achievement side, as I just mentioned, and we've been talking about for years, but it's on that connecting and how we connect with people. And I think early on, we really struggled with like we would get together on Zoom for happy hours. And I think most organizations experimented with that to try and maintain those connections. So I think that, though, is something that hasn't been sufficiently replaced. So developing that affiliative connection happens, I think, to a greater degree in the office than we can do than we can achieve from virtual meetings. So that would be I think the biggest aspect that's really missing, and the biggest challenge, I think, for us in how we develop those constructive workplaces.
Just want to add one thing to that, Michael. I think some of the biggest challenges are around what used to be called the informal organization. And people use examples like, discussions over the water cooler. Mm-hmm. And people just, accidentally having lunch together with someone from another unit where they have some shared concerns. It's so interesting how much in terms of coordination and learning and cooperation is done informally within organizations. And I do have a concern about how to replace that virtually, and really what takes that place. And there are even issues around safety, a lot of informal communication around problems and threats can straighten things out. So I don't know what the answer is, but I'm bringing that up as one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face if we completely get rid of offices. Kathleen?
I'll just say one other thing on that too. I think from what we've been talking about, achievement, we get things done working remotely. We maybe get more things done working remotely, and we might have more challenges in connecting. The aspect that I think is open to debate is developing, innovation and developing ideas. And I think about a few years ago, Marissa Mayer brought everyone from Yahoo into the office. She didn't want people working remotely, and part of that was so that Yahoo could develop some more innovative ideas. She wanted people to be interacting in the workplace, talking about things, and it didn't work for them. They didn't really, come up with any breakthroughs that really made them a thriving company again. And they might have suffered on some of the other things like getting things done, because she actually admitted that people get more work done at home. So, that's something that I don't know if we are going to suffer from lack of innovation to some degree, or less innovation from not being in the office. So that may be where the office is beneficial to some of that, to that aspect.
Yeah, I think solving certain kinds of problems truly are facilitated by physical presence. You mentioned one, and particularly important to that innovation and creativity is what they used to call cross-fertilization. People with different backgrounds, people from different parts of the organization, getting together, physically getting together and exchanging ideas with very, very different perspectives. The other one is coordination of interdependencies, particularly complex interdependencies, sometimes called reciprocal interdependencies. It really is easier to coordinate very complicated interdependencies even if you're together and can instantly look at the person and do something about it. So yeah, it probably depends on what kind of problems we're talking about solving. And I guess it's possible that we will eventually come up with ways of doing even these things quite well virtually, but I think we're still trying to perfect it, so to speak.
Yep.
We have time for a couple more questions. Here's one. It's how do you suggest aligning program team culture with the organizational culture? This person is on a large transformational project with over 60 people on the team, and they are adopting an agile approach, which introduces a lot of new behavioral expectations that don't align with the way the rest of the organization behaves. What's the best way to help program team members adapt to these dynamics? I have one thought on this, and that would be, of course, from my perspective, measuring and understanding the culture. What are the behaviors that are currently expected in that group versus what are the behaviors currently expected in the larger organization, and have a language and a framework for understanding those behaviors in both cultures and comparing it to the ideal or to your written values in terms of what you believe works and what you believe leads to effectiveness. There may be opportunities for change even at the larger organization level. Michael, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, a program and a group that is, operating in an agile kind of process, it's not, doesn't have to be distinct from the greater organization. So I think it's, again, not necessarily that nesting of a particular kind of culture, but it's being just what we've seen practiced to be effective for all organizations, and that's to be constructive, whether it's within an agile group or whether it's with the wider organization.
And we do actually have some research on the successful implementation of agile using constructive cultures, and the ideal culture for implementing agile successfully is a constructive one.
Yes, another thing is that the constructive culture makes it easier for organizations and organizational units like the one we're talking about to be ambidextrous. The ambidextrous organization is able to switch, for example, between agile approaches and traditional approaches to programming. And working with some agile specialists, they got me into the literature that talks about agile being appropriate for certain kinds of tasks, but really being very inefficient for other kinds of tasks. And it's important for a unit like the program you were talking about to be able to exhibit both approaches. And interestingly, there's research that shows that organizations with general positive cultures, general constructive cultures, have units that are better able to switch between two different approaches. So it's possible if they sort of take an ambidextrous perspective and work toward a constructive organization, they may have a chance at solving that problem. I'd have to know more about it, but this is one of the first things that sort of comes to mind. Good question.
We actually have a few more really thought-provoking questions, and I'm thinking and hoping that we can do a blog post with a Q&A to follow up on this webinar and answer some of those questions, at least a couple of them. So stay tuned for that. We'll make that a priority. As I said, we do only have 1 more minute left, so we will conclude here. Thank you so much again for joining us and for all of these great questions that you asked. For additional assistance, please feel free to email me directly. My email is up here on the screen. You can, of course, also email our info line for any general questions, and feel free to visit our website for the resources mentioned today or any other resources. Thank you so much again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kathleen and Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kalani.